Good morning everyone, thanks for coming on Saturday. My name's Pauline Cullen and today I'm going to try to demystify true, false, not given questions for you. If you Google the term IELTS expert, you'll get over 23,000 hits. So I'm going to give you a bit of background just to give you some context to the comments that I'm going to be making today. My very first academic reading was in 1995. That's when I started writing test materials. And over the 20 years since then, I've worked with several different teams producing academic reading, general training, although we've stopped all of that now, mostly academic reading and listening materials. I've also written 5 books with Cambridge University Press, 2 aimed at looking at the grammar for IELTS and 2 vocabulary for IELTS. And the final one, which we're talking a little bit about today, is the official Cambridge Guide to IELTS, and I wrote the skills section for that. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. I set up those accounts in 2012 so that I could answer any questions, obviously publicise the books as well, but also to answer any questions. And I became really aware of how much confusion there is about IELTS, but also how much confusing advice there is. So some of the things that I've learnt through talking to people on my Facebook page, mostly it's Facebook that they interact with me on, as there are some common misconceptions about IELTS. When people find some material that says IELTS, they assume that it's authentic. I often say to people, if they ask me a question about a test that they send me or a link they send me, I'll say, that's not authentic material, that's why you're confused. And they'll say, no, I found it on IELTS.net, IELTS blog, IELTS whatever. If they see the word IELTS, they assume it's authentic. And that goes hand in hand with assuming that it's by Cambridge. I just want to make the point that all the comments I make today, when I talk about authentic materials, I'm talking about those written by Cambridge. It doesn't matter which test centre you take the test in, whichever country you take the test in, all of the tests are written and produced in the same way through Cambridge. So I'm going to be talking only about those materials today when I say authentic materials. There's also a certain skepticism I've found. If I explain something, people tend to come back with, well, it can't be that simple. Cambridge must be hiding something from us. And then they follow this up with, but what about when it says? And that led me here into the mist, if you like. And if you Google or on YouTube, if you look on YouTube alone, you'll find 42 pages with videos explaining how IELTS true, false, not given works. I didn't even search for yes, no, not given. I will just say that the comments today, just for brevity, I'm only going to talk about true, false, not given. Yes, no, not given works in exactly the same way. The advice that I give applies to both. The difference is in the passages. The passages contain facts, if it's true, false, not given, and the passages contain opinions and claims, if it's yes, no, not given. Okay? So the advice that I'm giving you today about how to tackle them applies to both. If we watch some of these videos, we get introduced to this mysterious world of true, false, not given. Everyone seems pretty happy with the idea of true, although there are some dubious examples to be found on the videos. It's when it comes to false that there's a little bit more confusion, and people always tend to compare it to not given. And when we describe how not given works, it's a really mysterious world that we're delving into. Notice I put reading way over to the side because reading skills actually usually don't come into these videos in terms of the explanation. Some of the very common comments found online in a lot of these videos, you'll hear things like, these are the most difficult questions on the reading test, probably the most confusing questions in IELTS. They try to trick you, and they advertise the videos by saying things like, this lesson offers practice exercises and highlights common traps used by IELTS. So this is the idea being put out through a lot of these videos, that it's confusing, it's difficult, there are tricks, there are traps. And I just want to point out this they try to trick you. I'll refer to that a bit later because it is quite significant. The other side of the argument is that you can use your logic to answer these questions. You can answer 80% without having to look at the passage, one video proclaims. Another one says, one mismatch means false, two mismatches is not given. And don't bother looking for not given items, there's nothing to find. Now, I will just point out, in case I forget, everything in red is something that I personally disagree with and I believe is completely inaccurate. Okay. The link with all of these, the it's tricky, complicated, difficult camp, and the use your logic and the patterns. So we've got it's complicated and it's actually quite easy. The common link between the two is the evidence that they use to support these theories. And the problem with the evidence that they give is it's not IELTS. So there's a nice irony actually in that the comments they're making are not given in the test. So let's look at the evidence they use on these videos. This one, the most difficult, confusing questions, they try to trick you with the words. Now this tricking idea, you'll see this a lot, and it's always with these words being highlighted. All, some, most, always, never. There's really a lot of warnings about those words. So let's look at the evidence. This video has almost 1 million views, and the lady stands, I've changed the country name so that I'm protecting the innocent. The lady says, if it says all people in Novaland like to eat poutine, and you see a sentence saying some people in Novaland like to eat poutine, even though you see the two words, poutine, poutine, one says always, one says some, so this would be not a true statement. She's right, it is confusing, isn't it? I'm confused by that. The problem with that is, though, this is tricking, not testing. And it isn't IELTS. The same video goes on to explain how not given works and gives this example. The text says, although once eradicated from Novaland, bedbugs have made a comeback and are now considered one of the leading pests in the city. And then she says, and here's our not given question, rats are the most common nuisance that Novalandians face. And the argument is, rats aren't there, so that's not given. If you follow the comments down below these videos, you'll find lots of people saying, hang on, why isn't that false? And they're quite right. That's a typical new writer approach to writing. There are two possible answers there. It's both false and not given. But the point is that that's not IELTS. That's what this lady is putting forward as her view of IELTS, which causes a lot of confusion, I think. This is not how IELTS questions are written. We can see if we change the word rats to bedbugs, it's now true. So there is some information in there about which is the most common nuisance. So you can't say that's not given. It has two possible answers. This is not IELTS, and you'll often follow the comments below where we find people saying, I'm really confused now, could you please help? And what about the you can use your logic people? There are plenty of texts and questions that support this theory, but they're all to be found online. This is a typical one. Bread is the most widely consumed food in the world. Not only is it an important source of carbohydrates, it's also small and easy to carry. And the question says, bread contains carbohydrates, which is supposed to be a true statement, which it is. But the problem is that there is no new information in that passage, and so this is completely guessable. From what we know already of bread, we know the answer. We don't need to read. The problem is, though, that this is not IELTS. So people are using evidence not related to IELTS to make comments and draw conclusions about IELTS. In my Vocabulary for IELTS book, Unit 16 teaches the vocabulary related to natural resources, alternative fuels, and there's a yes, no, not given test practice at the end that seems to have appealed to quite a few people. On at least 3 occasions, I have found people changing the text and the items to make their point. In this particular video, you can see 241,920 views. Changes the wording so that the result is confusing, and there are now 2 possible answers. We're going to look at that in detail later. This one changes the last one to a negative, and the result of that is there's now a tricksy triple negative. So 3 negatives, all to make the point, this is how they try to trick you. So none of these people say, oh, by the way, I wrote this, this is how I'm trying to trick you. They use the word they to infer that these are authentic materials when they aren't. Test writing is technical writing. Small changes make a big difference. So if you're ever tempted to make a change to a text to make the point to your students, please stop yourself, because the reason you can't find an example in authentic materials is because it's not there. So why is this a problem? Well, bad examples lead to faulty conclusions about the test, which lead to bad advice. And this doesn't just apply to true, false, not given. We can find bad advice about multiple choice questions. This one says, eliminate all the silly options in the multiple choice. And the example on the video, it says, for example, if it's a question about the sun, and one option will say, the sun is cold, so you can just cross that one out. That's not how testing works. It's not how IELTS works. It's not how the tests are written. Another says 80% of matching heading questions can be answered just by reading the first and last sentence. And here we have you should be able to answer 80% without checking the passage. This tells us about the bad examples they've seen or written themselves. It doesn't tell us about IELTS. And this kind of advice takes the focus off language learning, and it also keeps candidates stuck at the same band and makes them very frustrated. IELTS is a valid test, a fair test, a reliable test. So how do we know? It takes more than 12 months, 6 different review stages, 6 to 7 expert writers, 200 to 300 IELTS pre-candidates or students to produce live test material. All of that information at each stage, we make sure there are no tricks, no traps. We make sure that it's a fair test. And we do that by looking at the reliability through pre-test review. We look at the pre-tests, we look at new material and compare it to material we know the level of to decide the level and make sure it's a fair and reliable test. And that produces statistics like this, for example. This is a mock-up. I've just mocked this up to show you, to give you an idea. But for every single question, we sit and look at every single answer, every option that the candidates have produced to make sure it's reliable. So for a true, false, not given, you divide up the candidates to know which ones are in your top 6, 7, 8 bands, which ones are in your low bands, and you assess how have they approached this question. How many of them put true, false, not given? Was there any confusion? Okay. So that one, the answer key was true. 87% of the high group chose it. The low group were a bit confused, didn't know. Okay. Unfair and unreliable questions are rejected at this point. So this would be like our guessable item that we had, the bread contains carbohydrates question, where you can see the statistics are not helpful there. It tells us we can guess the answer without reading, so it's not a valid or reliable test of reading. And this one, where there are 2 possible answers, your high group will tell you that. Okay, you don't need to look and assess it yourself. We can use the statistics that we get to see there are 2 possible answers there. You'll see the answer key says it's supposed to be not given, but most of the high group chose false. So there's a problem there within the item. And so these types of questions are rejected. So let's have a look at how it does actually work in the test. What does not given mean? True tells us, the passage tells us this is correct. And it's that tells us that I think is really important. We often just say true means it's right. But I think it's got to be it tells us that it's right. And similarly for false, the passage tells us this is wrong. This is a common problem when people write their own materials. They get this bit wrong. And not given is we don't know from this passage alone. Not given does not mean, and again, in a lot of the materials I've seen that are available online and so on, make this mistake. Probably not, but it's just not written here. Probably, but it's not written here. If you can assume it from the passage, then it's given. It does not mean that. It means it could be true or it could be false. We just don't know. So how do you tackle true, false, not given questions? There is a statement. You use your reading skills to decide and reach a conclusion about whether the statement is true, false, or not given. Which reading skills are needed in the true, false, not given question? I have given talks about this before. In the official Cambridge Guide to IELTS, we looked at the skills, the specific reading skills you need for every type of question. And there are materials to help outline those and to work through them. So the aim was to put the focus back on language skills and language learning. So we need scanning skills, skim reading skills, and we need to recognize, paraphrase, and so on. So the reading skills we need for true, false, not given are to scan for the specific information that we're looking for, to skim read, to make sure we've found the right part of the text. We then read in detail to reach a conclusion. Okay? I'm going to show you how that works with an authentic question type now. I searched through a lot of test books to try and find one with always, because so many of the videos highlight that as a problem, tricky word. I only found 4, by the way, just so you know, in about 100 true, false, not given questions. So this question is from book 9. It's the text about turtles, if you're familiar with it. The question says, it is always difficult to determine where an animal lived when its fossilized remains are incomplete. The passage says, you might wonder how we can tell whether fossil animals lived on land or in water, especially if only fragments are found. Sometimes it's obvious. Ichthyosaurs were reptilian contemporaries of the dinosaurs with fins and streamlined bodies. The fossils look like dolphins, and they surely lived like dolphins in the water. With turtles, it's a little less obvious. So the first thing we do is to scan to locate. Notice that we know where to look. Then we skim read to check that this is relevant. And yes, it's very relevant to our question, our very specific question. It's really important, I've made this point before, but it's very important to understand that IELTS is about being precise. Precise in your reading and precise in your writing. And then we read in detail to answer. So our specific question is, it is always difficult. Is it always difficult to determine? No, sometimes it's obvious. And with turtles, it's a little less obvious. Okay, so there's our answer. Notice that it's very easy to spot, very clearly there, as long as you use your reading skills. The people who find this really difficult are the ones who don't use reading skills at all. The lower levels will probably stop after the first sentence, thinking they've found it, and then perhaps reach a faulty conclusion about whether the information is there or not. Notice that you generally have to read a chunk of text. It's about reading the passage. The other thing to point out is with a false question, you can correct it based on the passage. So the point is that the answer is very clearly wrong according to the passage. I'm going to quickly go through a not given question now. So, turtles were among the first group of animals to migrate back to the sea. This is the part of the test, the passage. We scan to locate the information. We skim read to check that it's relevant. We're talking about a group of animals, like all vertebrate returnees to the water. Yes, we're in the right part. Then we read in detail to answer. Turtles were among the first group of animals. Is there any information there about the first group of animals to return back to the sea? No, there isn't. There is no information about the first animals to go back to the sea. It may be true, it may be false. We can't correct it. The answer is not given. So we can't correct not given statements. But it's really important to point out that we know where to look. So all those videos that say don't bother looking for true, false, for not given questions because they're not there, when you find something, you're going to be thinking, well, it must be either true or false because I found something, all right? So it's about really precisely answering that question. And that information, that precise information, is not there. Going back to the change that was made from the book that I told you about. So the book version says this, and the question is, at present in America, 400 million acres of land are used for agriculture. This is the part that gives you the information. Notice that you have to understand referencing within that sentence to be able to answer it. This number is a sizable fraction of the total US land area and considerably more than the 400 million acres currently under cultivation. So yes, that's correct. It's correct that at the moment 400 million acres of land are used for agriculture. This is the change that was made. Sorry, the focus is on understanding the reading passage. This is the change that was made to the online one. Now, what's significant here is that the person saying this said they. Okay, so the implication is that this is from a real test, and it isn't. It's from the person's own writing, basically. So their version said, just over 400 million acres of land is being used for agriculture in America. And the question, at present in America, about 400 million acres of land is allocated for agriculture. The speaker says that's a true one. And below we can see all the people asking, why isn't it not given? And what's happened is we're focusing on is being used as opposed to is allocated. Allocated suggests to me that perhaps the government has decided this amount of land can be used for agriculture. It doesn't tell us how much is being used for agriculture. So it's about precise reading. So we have to be very precise in our writing. Below is a comment saying, I'm confused. Notice the focus as well is on words. In a lot of these videos, that's a common mistake. People focus on differences in words. This is not testing reading skills. And can you see the difference? That here, the focus is always on the reading passage. But with these examples, the focus is always on small words within the question. This is not IELTS. Also wanted to point out some faulty logic that I've noticed some people on Facebook using with me. One of the people on Facebook who contacted me said, but if it's not in the text, it can't be true. And so there's a problem there with the candidate thinking, this must be giving me all the information I need. This is fairly typical in general training readings where you're given part of a brochure or something like that. So they're assuming that if it's not in this brochure, it can't be true, otherwise it would be in there. So there's a faulty logic going on. And I think it's important to point out to your students that what they're looking at is an extract. It's quite possible there's another part to the document, and that's where the information is. The point is that you can't check from this document alone or this extract alone. Remember also to teach them that you can correct a false statement because of the information that is in the text, and you can't do that with not given. You can only reach a conclusion based on the information you're given. Okay, so how to tackle true, false, not given questions? The number one rule is always use authentic test materials. To teach your students to trust the test, that there are no tricks and no traps. The reason those people had to write their own is because they couldn't find them in the authentic materials. And it wasn't because they didn't have the time, it's because they're not there. Work on scanning, skimming, and reading for detail. And check for faulty logic when your students reach a conclusion. Don't change authentic materials to make a point. And just one final point. This is from a book review of the official Cambridge Guide. It's a great review. All aspects of the test are covered in a user-friendly way. There are tips and hints on every page, and the practice tests really help students consolidate what they've learned. It's published by Cambridge, who also write the test, so you know that all the information is reliable. Great. And then, but Cambridge writes it, so they're not going to help you too much. They're not going to give you any insider knowledge. They can't give you as much advice as some of the more independent publishers. And then, as we've seen, people then start to think, those tricks and traps. And that's where the tricks and traps come from. If it's not in the book, it isn't in the test. Okay? Nobody's trying to hide anything. Thank you very much, everybody.